beoþ fluma, ultra splatcha, wisdom is olaftu and witten a floffer, and earlier wham ed nissun to hit.
I'm stood here today on the Wansdyke, one of the longest linear earthworks in the UK. Now, the Anglo-Saxons named this place Woden's Dyke after one of their most important gods. And in today's episode of Wyrdwayz, I want to talk to you all about the great god Woden. Wesaþ, and welcome to this episode of Wyrdwayz. Now, in today's episode I'm going to be speaking about the Anglo-Saxon rune Os, and as you can tell from the introduction, I want to speak a lot about the god Woden because I believe that this is the original meaning of this Anglo-Saxon rune. Now, this rune is one of the newer runes. The shape doesn't appear in either the Elder or the Younger Futhark. It is a shape which is unique to the Anglo-Frisian or the Old English or the Anglo-Saxon runes, whatever you wish to call them. And the shape of this rune is this, and the sound is an O sound, as in os. Before we get into this video, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of my subscribers. It's really great to see the subscription numbers going up. That makes me very happy. So it's great to have you here. If you like this video, I'd be really grateful if you could hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. That would be really helpful. Thank you. And I do now have a Patreon, and the details are in the description below. So, as I like to, I'm going to start with the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, and we're going to look at all of the rune poems that we have for this one. So the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, I'll give it to you first in Anglo-Saxon. Os beoþ fluma, ultra splatcha, wisdom is olaftu and witten a floffer, and earlier wham ed nissun to hit. And that is actually one of my favourite rune poems to recite. It feels very powerful to me. I just really think it flows well, and I really like the sound of that one. So in modern English, the mouth is the source of all language, a pillar of wisdom and a comfort to wise men, a blessing and a joy to every knight. Now, it's my belief that this poem, like many of the other Anglo-Saxon poems, has had a number done on it by the Christians that wrote it down. I believe that, like the last rune we looked at, Thorn, that it has been somewhat depowered and had the true meaning removed from it. So let's talk about that in a moment, but first let's look at the Icelandic rune poem. God aged Gautra, and Prince of Asgard, and Lord of Valhall. So that one has a very different meaning. It clearly, as I've said, is about the god Oðinn or Woden. The Norwegian rune poem is different still. Estuary is the way of most journeys, but a scabbard is of swords. So let's go back to the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. As I said, I believe it has had its meaning changed by the Christian scribes who committed it to vellum. It wouldn't have been in their best interests to promote any kind of reverence or popularity of Woden. So I believe that it is for that reason that the rune was changed by the time it was committed to vellum in the 8th or 9th centuries, well after the conversion period. Now, os is actually the Latin word, a Latin word for mouth. So I believe that the interpretation of this rune poem is completely outside of the Germanic tradition, and they have taken the Latin meaning of os as opposed to the Germanic meaning. Now there are indeed reasons why Odinn might be associated with the mouth. He was considered to be a god of poetry. Also in the Völuspá we hear how Odinn breathed life into 2 lifeless chunks of wood and created the first humans, Ask and Embla. He breathed life into them. So there are reasons why Woden, according to the Nordic sources, would be associated with the mouth. But before we move on, I just want to read to you from Simek's dictionary of Northern mythology about the meaning of Gautra, which was mentioned in the Icelandic rune poem. I'll just find that. Gautra and Gauti, names frequently recorded for Odin, which occur elsewhere as male personal names. So there we can see that that word is actually a word, one of the names of Odin, and he had many. But in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem it also mentions wisdom. Now, from the Nordic sources we know that Oðinn was a god who was in constant pursuit of wisdom and quite often made great sacrifices in order to gain the wisdom. He sought it relentlessly, even if it meant great suffering to himself. And we also know from the Nordic sources that they considered him to be a god of poetry. So what I really want to do in this video is talk about the evidence that we can find for the Anglo-Saxon god Woden within Anglo-Saxon sources. Now, it's not easy to find. As I've said before, history is written by the winners, and the winners in this case were the Christians. And Woden was a threat to them because he had such a very powerful hold over the minds and the imaginations of the Germanic tribes. So the last thing that they would want to do would be to extol the virtues of this heathen god. And of course, we know that early Anglo-Saxon society was not a literate society. Everything would have been oral, delivered by mouth. It wouldn't have been written down, and the people that wrote things down were Christians living some time after the conversion of this country to a Christian country. But Woden, as I said, he was very important to these Germanic peoples even post conversion, and he remained very much alive within the cultural imagination and was still cropping up in various forms post-conversion. So the first thing I want to do is just establish that scholars are generally agreed that Woden and Oðinn are the same god. Adam of Bremen, who was a German chronicler who lived in the second half of the 11th century, in his Deeds of the Bishops of Hamburg 1073 AD, he wrote about the Saxons. For the Saxons worshipped those who were not gods. Among them they venerated Woden, who they were to venerate on holy days, even with human sacrifice. Now he then goes on to talk about the temple at Uppsala in Sweden, which you've probably heard about for the the very great sacrifices that were made there every 9 years. And what he says about this is, in this temple, entirely decked out in gold, the people worship the statues of 3 gods in such wise that the mightiest of them, Thor, occupies a throne in the middle of the chamber. Wotan and Fricko have places on either side. The significance of these gods is as follows. Thor, they say, presides over the air, which governs the thunder and lightning, the winds and rains, fair weather and crops. The other, Wotan that is, the furious, carries on war and imparts to man strength against his enemies. Now he then goes on to say, for all their gods there are appointed priests that offer sacrifices for the people. If plague or famine threaten, a libation is poured to the idol Thor. If war, to Woden. If marriages are to be celebrated, to Fricko. So, yes, it is generally accepted that Woden, Wotan, is the same as Oðinn. In Old English it's Woden, as I've said. In Old High German it's Woden and Oðinn. It's not Odin, that's just I might have said that, I do apologise. It's an anglicisation of the word, but it was actually Oðinn. So it's unfortunate that with so few sources from Anglo-Saxon England, we do have to fill in the gaps. Well, there's lots of gaps, but we do have to fill them in using the Eddas, the Scandinavian sources. But then we are extremely lucky to have those sources, or we would know next to nothing about these gods. So the Eddas tell us many things about Oðinn. He is the principal god, the ruler of Asgard, the chief god. He's a god of war, a god of frenzy, of poetry and magic. He's a psychopomp, and he's also a shaman. Now the word wode, from the Anglo-Saxon word wode, from which Woden comes, is, according to the Bosworth Toller Anglo-Saxon Dictionary, means mad, raging, furious. And of course Adam of Bremen did refer to Wotan as the furious. So now, as I like to do, I want to go right back to some really early sources that come from the continent, back to Roman sources, and find out what the Romans said about how these gods were worshipped on the continent. Now, although this happened a long time before the period that we're talking about, a lot of the information still holds true in the beliefs and practices of the Germanic tribes, even after they had migrated to England. Now Caesar, in his Bello Gallico, states, most of all they worship the god Mercury. There are many images of him, and they say that he is the discoverer of all art, the ruler of roads and journeys, and they believe that he has greatest power in getting wealth and for merchants. After him come Apollo, Mars, Jupiter and Minerva. And then if we look to Tacitus in his Germania, chapter 9, he again associates the god worshipped by the Germanic tribes with Mercury, and says, Mercury is the deity whom they chiefly worship, and on certain days they deem it right to sacrifice to him with human victims. So we're getting this theme coming through that to this god human sacrifices were made. Now some scholars believe that the popularity of the Woden cult within these Germanic tribes was as a result of contact with the Romans, that this Roman god of trade and wealth and travel was effectively taken by the Germanic tribes and kind of morphed into this aristocratic warband leader who really would have had the perfect qualities for travelling warbands who were going out to seek land and treasures and expand into new realms. So we see the Lombards and the Goths moving south, we see the Anglo-Saxons moving west, and they embraced this god, this this war band leader, this god of frenzy, this god of war, this god that could give them all of the qualities that they needed to succeed in their missions. So as I said, there are very, very few sources left to us from the Anglo-Saxons, but one place we can find information is written into the landscape in the form of place names. Now, theophoric place names are basically places that have the names of deities, and we find quite a few theophoric place names, mainly in southern England, that bear the name of Woden. Now we can start with Woden's in Kent, and close to this location there was an excavation in which we found 30 glass Anglo-Saxon vessels. Now the Old English word beoþ, I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, means hill, but it's not just any hill, it's a specifically very continuously rounded profile hill. You know, the kind of hill you look at and think, that's a nice hill, or maybe you don't think that, I do. But that the Anglo-Saxons had a very specific name for that type of hill, and we see this again. The name it's given now is Adam's Graves, and it's a barrow in Wiltshire, close to the Ridgeway. But the original name was Woden's, and it does seem to be that the cult of Woden, both in this country and on the continent, was particularly connected to hills, that the cult places, the temples, the shrines would have been located on these particularly beautiful hills, or mounds. The Anglo-Saxons did seem to like mounds, burial mounds, and did seem to attach a lot of importance to them. Effectively, what we see is them attaching their myths and beliefs to these older Neolithic sites. Now we have some other hill places named after Woden as well. We have Wenslow 100 in Bedfordshire, the Old English word hlaw, and we have Worms Hill in Kent, the Old English word hill, which sounds pretty much like hill. So these were probably all sites dedicated to temples of Woden. Now the next we've got some places which end in feld, which, as you can probably guess, is the Anglo-Saxon word for field. Now it's fairly easy to imagine cult places for Woden being on hills, and perhaps not quite so easy to imagine cult places for Woden being in fields, but it appears that they were. We've got two lost place names to begin with. Both are in Essex. We've got Wednesfeld, and that was near in Thaden, or close to Thaden in Essex, and was recorded in 1446. And then Wadnesfeld in Widdington in Essex, and that was recorded in 1303. So these are names that have now disappeared but were recorded in earlier times as being connected to Woden. And then of course we've got the still known Wednesfield, which is 2 miles northeast of Wolverhampton and 3 or so miles from Wednesbury, which again is another place connected with Woden. So Wednesfield means Woden's field or open space, and then Wednesbury, just down the road from this place, means Woden's fortifications or earthworks. So clearly, with the fact that these places are very close to each other, we can sort of start to assume that this was a landscape dedicated to the god Woden. And interestingly, in 1315 we find recorded the name Wodneswala, meaning Woden's spring. Now this was recorded as a location within Wednesbury, so this could further support the fact that within this area of Staffordshire there was a ritual landscape dedicated to the god Woden. So now I want to go back to Woden or Woden's Barrow, now known as Adam's Graves, I mentioned before, because here again we have some rather strong evidence for a ritual landscape as part of a cult of Woden. Now the Ridgeway, for anybody that's not familiar with it, is a wonderful place. It's 85 miles long, and it starts near Tring at Ivinghoe Beacon, and it runs all through the countryside to does it actually go into Avebury? I believe it does actually run into Avebury in Wiltshire. And if you've never visited Avebury, you really should. It's an absolutely wonderful place. I've never visited Ivinghoe Beacon, so I can't say whether or not that's a wonderful place, but Avebury is certainly a very wonderful place and definitely worth visiting. So the name Ridgeway actually originated in Anglo-Saxon times. It's a very ancient trackway that would have been used for moving people and items across the landscape. It basically traces along the hills, hence its name Ridgeway. Now interestingly, Woden's Barrow is not the only landscape feature in that area that has the name connected with Woden. Now there are some other adjoining features. Unfortunately, I haven't yet been able to find out where they are, so this is definitely one that warrants further research and definitely a trip to this area at some point. We have Woden's Giat, Woden's Gate or Gap, and we have Woden's Dean, which is Woden's Field or Valley. And of course, very close to here, we have the Wansdyke, where I did my introduction from, Woden's Dyke. So here we see a very interesting collection of place names dedicated to Woden, all within very close proximity of the ancient Ridgeway track. Now, interesting still is the fact that in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle we have two incidences of battles having occurred at Woden's Dyke, now known as Adam's Graves. In 592 there was a battle, and it says, and there occurred great carnage in Britain this year at Woden's Barrow. And then later in 715 we have here Inna and Kilred fought at Woden's Barrow. So this is really interesting and could very much indicate that what we see here is an Wodinic cult centre dedicated to the war god, the furious one, the god of frenzy, and connected with battles and war. Now, I don't think it's any chance or mere coincidence that the battles happened at this spot. Normally a battle site will be chosen for various reasons, whether they be strategic or ritualistic. So there is a chance with these two battles being recorded at this site in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, at this site connected with the war god Woden, that this site was chosen on purpose for a reason connected to Woden. Now what makes this interesting further is that a sword fitting was found at Woden's Barrow, and it looks very much like this wasn't in any funerary context. It looks like it could have been a ritual deposit, and we know that swords and weapons were made as offerings to the gods. An interesting further interest is that, sorry I'm getting excited about this, is that just down the road there's a place called Knapp's Hill, and also a part of a sword was also found at Knapp's Hill, which again doesn't appear to be in a funerary context. So this is really, really, really interesting here. Of course there is no really firm evidence, but it looks very much like this area close to the Wansdyke and the Ridgeway, with all these place names connected with Woden. Looks very much like this could have been an important cult centre in Wiltshire to the Anglo-Saxons. Now there are also many other place names connected with Woden. We have Wanstead in Essex, Woden Steed, maybe we should call Wanstead Sleipnir. We have Woodbridge in Suffolk, Woden's Bridge. We have Womburgh in both Surrey and Wiltshire, another Woden's Barrow. They do like their barrows. And we have Warnbrook in Somerset, Woden's Brook. Now, as well as having these theophoric place names connected with the name Woden, we also see connection with this deity, but in a different one of his different guises. Now, we know that within the Norse sources, the Scandinavian sources, Oðinn was given many names. There is over 150 names listed for Oðinn, and one of his names within the Eddic sources is Grimnir or Grimma, and we know that the Anglo-Saxons called this god Grim. Now, there are actually no occurrences of the name Grim being used in any of the written Anglo-Saxon sources, but again we can find it written into the landscape in the form of place names. So we have Grimspound, an Iron Age settlement on Dartmoor, and here you can see me at this absolutely amazing place one day many moons ago in 2009. Really great place, thoroughly suggest you visit it. And then we have Grimes Graves in Norfolk, which is a Neolithic flint mine. Now, the Anglo-Saxons used to meet at Grimshoe Mound at this site, which basically hale means burial mound. Here it comes again. So they used to meet at this place within Grimes Graves and gave it the name of their god. There's loads of examples all across the country of Grimm's ditches or Grimm's Dyke in Hampshire, Essex, Middlesex, Oxfordshire, Wiltshire. They're basically everywhere. And there's also many Devil's Dykes. There's one close to where I come from, and I believe that again that could have been originally connected with Woden, and then later in medieval times, as Woden was demonised, they picked up the name Devil's Dyke. So I think now's a good time to tell you a little bit of personal gnosis, a story of something that happened to me a few summers ago in 2017. So I had decided to take a few days off work during the summer holidays and take my daughter back to my homeland, stay with my parents, and take my mum and my daughter to some sites around East Anglia that I really should have visited when I lived there and never did. So we did 3 places in 3 consecutive days. Day 1, I drove them out to Suffolk and we went to Sutton Hoo. Now, apparently I did go there when I was very small, according to my dad, but I can't remember. And we had a really great time there. We went on a tour. It wasn't until the tour was finished that we realised we should have paid for it and didn't. Oops. So yeah, that was really good doing that because we discovered a lot of history. And I will talk about something that I discovered there. But one thing that kind of stuck out to me was that the tribe who had built those burial mounds were the Wofingers. Now, the Wofingers were a tribe who had originally come from Jutland and had settled in the Sandlings area and had created the great kingdom of East Anglia. Now, the Wofingers, named after their king Wuffa, which means little wolf, they considered themselves to be descendants of Woden, and this kind of stuck in my mind at the time. Now, the treasures found at Sutton Hoo, absolutely amazing, not just beautiful, but so interesting, and they can tell us so much about the beliefs and understandings and practices of the Wofingers. And within the artifacts found at this site, We see all sorts of things. We see evidence of shamanistic practices for accessing other worlds. We see animism and totemism. We see Woden cults. We can gain so much information from the artifacts found, but I just remember that thing about them being descended from Woden really sticking very firmly in my mind. So the next day, drove to Norfolk, and we went to Grimes Graves, a Neolithic flint mine, a very unusual landscape now because of all the mines that have been dug. It looks quite alien in many ways. And when I was there, I of course found out that the Anglo-Saxons had given it that name after Grim, and that they used to meet there. So I thought, well, hang on, this is a bit weird. With day 1, Woden connection, day 2, Woden connection. So the next day, we were going just down the road to Ely Cathedral, and I thought, well, absolutely no way I'm going to find anything to do with Woden in Ely Cathedral. It's a Christian cathedral, the Ship of the Fens. I'm not going to find anything to do with Woden there. I was wrong. Or maybe I'm just putting a tenuous link on this, but I found this bloody great stone. To me it just looked like a massive Thor's hammer, but it was called Oðinn stone, and there's me going, hang on a minute, I know this isn't historically true because the plaque on the wall tells me that this pre-7th century Saxon artifact is in fact a cross that was found in Haddenham just down the road from Ely, and is actually connected to Oðinn, who was Ethelreda's faithful steward. But the fact that this stone, this massive great stone, is just sitting in Ely Cathedral on a day where I thought I would find nothing to do with Oðinn, and it's called Oðinn stone, and it looks like a big Thor's hammer. Well, that just struck me as incredibly weird and good. And I don't know, this is personal gnosis, and I don't know if anybody else has found this, but I always find when connecting with the god Woden or Oðinn that synchronicities abound. Every time I start connecting with this god, I have the most strange synchronicities. And I'll tell you the story again. I'm just going to reach down here and pick up my drum. This is my drum that I painted for myself. Can you see it? And you can see I've painted Odinn's ravens on here. Hugin and Moonin, thought and memory. It's got a really raveny sound, I think. Anyway, I painted this drum in 2018 actually. I was going to Sweden to study Seitha, Norse shamanism magic. And I just felt that I should have a drum of my own, because up till that point I'd only been painting drums for other people and I didn't know what to paint on it. I then had the most strange sequence of synchronicities that basically led me to paint Odinn's or Woden's ravens onto my drum. So I always tell people that Oðinn made me do it. But I always find that connecting with this god turns up the most strange synchronicities. I don't know if anybody else has found that. So another thing that I noticed when I was at Sutton Hoo, I found out that there was a rather gruesome part to the stories. In that later centuries, the site had been used as a gallows site for executions by hanging. And that kind of stuck in my mind because there were some fairly gruesome sand bodies there. But then after visiting Wansdyke recently to film the introduction for this video, I then found out that there were also gallows sites at Wansdyke. Now, some of the oldest reference to Wansdyke mention gallows in 957. There's a document that refers to Thawir Roda on Woodnus Dyk, the felon's gallows on Wodensdyke, which was on the boundary of St Stanton St Bernard. So how excited was I when I looked up where Stanton St Bernard was and the site of these gallows on the Wodensdyke, to find that they were basically within the possible ritual landscape centred around Woden's Barrow. So I just found that fascinating. It's all kind of, to me, it's all kind of linked. Now, I've also been trying to work out where the place is that's called Redshaw. Now, this is actually the place where the Ridgeway and Wodensdyke intersect each other and form a crossroads. Now, crossroads are very significant within magical practices. There's significant sites, they're liminal sites, there's places between the worlds, and within English folk magic you find lots of references to spells being done at crossroads, and then you have, different Greek deities associated with crossroads like Hecate. Now actually the significance of using these crossroads, these liminal sites for executions, goes right back to Anglo-Saxon times. That's when it originated. But the interesting thing is, this Redshaw site, which is the intersecting point between the Ridgeway and the Wodensdyke, is the only part of the Wodensdyke that can be seen from the middle of the henge at Avebury. Now, make of that what you will. I just found it very interesting. And of course, magic would have been done under the bodies of the hanged of criminals on the gallows. So I just found that really interesting. Anyway, so we've looked at the significance of place names, theophoric place names in England, and possible connections to cults of Woden. So I seem to have rambled on for a while. So in the next episode I'm going to be talking about Woden as the next part of this episode, part 2, I'm going to be talking about Woden as progenitor of the English royal families. I'm going to be talking about Woden as he appears in healing charms connected with magic. We're going to be talking a little bit about witchcraft, a little bit about Wesaþ, and a little bit about shape-shifting. So next part of this episode is going to be quite magical. So I hope you will check it out. Thank you so much for watching. As I said, if you like this video, please give me a like and subscribe to this channel. It's very much appreciated. And I will see you for the next part of this episode about the Anglo-Saxon Rune Os very soon. Thanks so much. See you soon. Hale.